Session is called Overriding Configuration in Drupal 8. It's not the most exciting title, but it describes exactly what we're going to be talking about today. How many are currently working in Drupal 8? And you feel pretty comfortable with configuration in general? Well, this isn't a beginner configuration topic, but I'm going to kind of just make sure we're on the same page and just give a brief overview at the beginning, so we're all kind of at the same point. Obligatory introduction. I'm Rick Hawkins, RL Hawk on Drupal.org and most other places. I run a business doing web development and design and consulting in the Seattle area, and I've been working with Drupal for about 10 years now. I help to organize the Seattle Drupal Users Group. We have regular monthly meetings and and we also sort of help to organize this event. Next year it will be around this time, February, in Seattle. So we hope to see you all there also. I also maintain a handful of modules on Drupal.org, most of them security related. So the key module, encrypt, and Real AES, which provides encryption. So here's that intro part I was talking about. Just basically, what are we talking about when we're talking about configuration in Drupal 8? And the documentation says that it's a collection, the documentation on Drupal.org says it's a collection of administrative settings for a Drupal site. And it's to be distinguished from content. So nodes, taxonomy terms, users, that's all content. What we're talking about is the settings that help make the site run the way you want. And so some examples of the types of configuration we're going to be talking about today. Site name, that's one I'm going to use as an example a lot of times because it's very easy to tell when that's been overridden because it shows up right on the front page. And content types, and basically any entity bundle, so taxonomy vocabularies, users, and then any fields that are attached to them. All of those definitions for those are going to be configuration. And of course, all the definition for views will be configuration also. So why would you want to override configuration? One of the main reasons is to have different configuration on your production server compared with your development server. You might want to have a sandbox API key for your development server, but the real API key on production. And you want to make sure that those don't get accidentally deployed in one direction or the other. And you also might want to customize your configuration by language if you have a multilingual site, and that is fairly easy to do in Drupal 8, in Drupal 8 Core. If you want to prevent configuration from being changed, it's sort of a way to lock in a particular configuration value. And there's some confusing things about that I'll get into. But it's very effective at making sure that you don't change a value when you didn't mean to. And it's effective for protecting, if you want to protect sensitive information. So again, API keys, passwords, anything that you don't want. In fact, that's the next slide. So what do I mean by sensitive information? So keys, API keys, passwords for like SMTP password if you're using the SMTP module, and basically anything you wouldn't want people to see that's part of your configuration. So we'll take a step back and talk about what configuration was like in Drupal 7. Many of you probably remember that for the most part, configuration consisted of variables stored in the variable table, and those were site-wide configuration. The other option was to have custom tables that a particular module would define, and there was no standardized way of doing that. So every module that needed its own configuration would create its own tables and have its own schema, and It caused a lot of challenges if you were trying to work with your site's configuration. And every site would need to have, if you use the features module, would need to support features in its own particular way rather than having sort of a standard Drupal way of handling your configuration. And the way you would do overrides in Drupal 7, the primary way would be to define a value in the $conf global variable, usually in a settings.php file, settings.local, local.settings, some include file that you're including in settings.php. So the example here is overriding the site name, and it was just as simple as saying conf site name is overridden value. And you could only override variables that were in the variable table in Drupal 7 this way, not anything that had been defined in a custom table, in a table that was specific to a particular module. A couple of problems with overrides in Drupal 7 is that the values, the override values, would get displayed on the settings page for the module, which, if you're trying to protect that information, is counterproductive. It doesn't help you there. And in addition, if you save that form, your override value is going to get put in the database. So if you're trying to keep configuration data out of the database, it's very easy for it to creep back in. And that's been addressed in Drupal 8, but I'll talk about the complications with that also. Does anybody have any questions so far or comments about? Okay. So in Drupal 8, there is a standardized way of doing configuration, and everything is stored in the config table instead of in a variety of tables that the module defines. It is, the modules say, define the schema that they want to use, and then that data is stored always in the config table. And the configuration is exportable to YAML files for deploying between environments. In Drupal 8, there are two general categories of configuration. The first one being simple configuration, and that is, let me just say the two first, because then I have more slides. And then also configuration entities. So simple configuration is when you just have a single instance of a configuration collection. And they're generally site-wide settings, so something like your site settings that would include your site name as one of the values. You're only going to need one of those. You don't need multiple instances of that. And the values that are used there are defined in the schema file that the module provides, the module that needs those settings. And the configuration is automatically removed when the module is installed. And the way simple configuration is named is, in fact, fairly simple. It's just the configuration ID, which consists of, usually the first part is the module that provides the configuration. So in the example here, we're talking about the site information, the general site information, and it's provided by the system module. So the configuration for that is system.site. And the element, and that's an array of values. It's in the database, it's stored as a serialized PHP array, but one of the elements in there will be the name, have the ID name, and that will hold the value for your site's name. Configuration entities are a bit more complicated. There can be multiple instances, essentially unlimited number of these types of configuration. So they're similar to content entities, but they're not fieldable the way content entities are. You can't attach fields to them. The fields or properties that are going to get defined with the configuration are defined by the module that created them, that creates them. They integrate with the configuration API provided by Drupal core, and they are allowed to declare dependencies on other configurations. So if you've ever gone to delete a particular configuration and seen a list of all the things that are going to happen when that gets deleted. And some of them are not related to the particular module that provides the configuration that you're deleting. That's because of the dependency management, which is really useful. So you know you can see exactly what other effects you're going to have on your site when you delete a particular configuration. And the way those are defined is in an entity definition, in an annotation. If you're curious, in Drupal 8 there are lots of things that are defined in annotations, things like plugins, new entity types, and that's where a lot of the values for configuration entities are set. And then there's a schema file that goes along with it. The schema file is used largely for translation, so that the location module will know what values need to be translated and provide an interface, help provide an interface for translating those. And again, those are automatically removed when the module is installed. So the naming for configuration entities is a little more complex, and it starts with the machine name of the entity. So in the case of nodes, for instance, that would be node. And then, or in my example here, actually the first ID is the module that provides it. So we've got views, and then there's a prefix, and again that's defined in an annotation by the module, in this case the views module, that the prefix is called view, and then a configuration ID. In this case, it's called front page. So everything included in the configuration view front page will be all about the view that provides the default front page for your website, the one that sort of gets installed automatically or gets added automatically when you use the standard installation profile. And so an example of an element ID within that array of configuration values is, it's fairly long in this case, display, default, display options, title. So what this is the title of the default display in the front page view. Is that clear? So the point is that you can get very granular in what you are overriding. So in this case, if we just want to override a title for whatever reason, we can do that. Or override a title of a view, we can do that on a very specific level. So how do you know, if you want to override a configuration value, how do you know what the ID is that you want to override? You saw the naming pattern, but it's still, you may not know exactly what a value or what a configuration is going to be called. So there are a number of different ways to do it. You can take a look at your configuration files when you export your configuration. If you've seen those, you see how they've been named. Those are named exactly the way you would expect to then override them. You can use Drush's config get command, which is very useful. So this is a demo site here, and it doesn't have anything special running on it, but if I do config get, you'll see I get a list of all the configuration on my site, and I can see, and I can choose one to investigate further. In this case, I'm going to take a look at the one we've been kind of continuing to use as an example, the system site configuration. And in this case, you can see there's the name, there's the admin mail, etc. And as you'll notice here also that the configuration items can be nested. So in this case we have a value called page and then 403, 404 in front. And these values are, you can probably figure out if you look at the settings form for the site information, you can figure out which fields these match up to. When you are referencing a value. So in this case, we would use system site, and then if we wanted to override, say, the front page, the way you do that when you're dealing with nested values is we'd call it page and then dot front.
Can you make the text a little bigger?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Is that a little better? It's pretty low too. So if you're dealing with these in PHP, they're going to be using the usual nested array format with the square brackets, but when you're referring to them, if you're overriding, you're going to use a dot notation to separate the various levels. If you use the configuration manager, which is built into Drupal core, you can take a look at the export screen and find a value there. You can use, there's another module called configuration inspector, and or you can use the configuration update module. So I'll show you those. So here's, if you go to the configuration manager, you have this export tab. And if you choose the configuration you want, in this case I'm choosing simple configuration, system site. Again, we're seeing the same values that we saw in the drush command. The configuration inspector module is a contributed module, but it's very handy for, especially if you're developing a module and defining your own configuration, making sure that it's valid, because see how it says in the schema column, it says correct. It will tell you if there's a problem, how many errors there are in your schema. And it's very important that it be right, because as I said, that's used largely for language, for translation. So you want to make sure all your values can be translated. So again, the configuration keys are exactly what you would expect. If we were to scroll down, we'd see the system site configuration, and then we can inspect it using any of the number of formats available on the right-hand side. Just a general list, tree, see it as a form, see it as raw data, so you can kind of explore it however you want. So this is the inspect tab here. Is that? So in this case we can say, look for everything provided by the system module. In this case there's system site. Again, we can take a look at the various elements and see that name is one of them and what the current value is. Does anybody have questions about that? So there are a number of different ways to find out what the idea is when you're looking to do a configuration override. So I mentioned that there were some confusing things about the way overrides are handled in Drupal 8. One of them is that the override values in Drupal 7, I said that they appeared in the forms. In Drupal 8 they don't, which can be confusing because you've overridden the value, you go to the form, and you don't see the value there. You see the old value that exists in the database, and there's no indication that the value is overridden. So you might say, great, that looks good, but you don't know it's being overridden. So there is an issue that was created 3 years ago about getting an indicator on configuration forms if values are overridden. And one of the main things that blocked it was that there was no way to actually determine if a value was overridden. So originally, when this first started, they were just comparing the original value to the value. They retrieved the value without overrides, and then they retrieved the value with overrides and compare them. And if they're the same, they assume that they're not overridden. But somebody pointed out that if you have an override value that's the same, it's going to give you an incorrect response that it's not overridden when it is. So a new method was created on the config class, and it checks to see if a value is overridden. So this just got committed a couple weeks ago, I think, a week ago. And so now that that's done, that we may start to see an indicator at the top of forms if a value is overridden. So the way that works, if you want to detect if a value is overridden, you use the has overrides method. And here are a couple of examples checking to see if the system site configuration has been overridden. If you don't include an item name, like in this case, we're checking to see if in the second example, we're checking to see if the name is overridden, and in this case it's true. And then in the third one, we're checking to see if the male value in the system site configuration is overridden, and it's false. But if you don't specify a value, it gives you true if any of the values in that configuration are overridden. So again, this would be used if you were writing a module where you needed to check to see if values were overridden. So there are a number of different ways to override configuration, and these are listed in the order of precedence, I guess. From top to bottom, the config global variable is top priority. And this is very, I'll get to that in a minute. Second one is module overrides, providing overrides in a module. And then third is language overrides. So if you have language overrides and then a module that does overrides on top of that, the module is going to take preference. If you have a config global variable definition, that's going to take precedence over either of them. The config global variable is very similar to the conf global variable in Drupal 7. It's just been renamed. And in this case, if we want to override the system site name, we just say config system site name overridden site name. So it's slightly different from our Drupal 7 example, but still fairly similar. The difference is in Drupal 8, configuration entities can also be overridden. So in this case, I'm overriding the title of the front page, the default display of the front page view. So that can get fairly complicated. And as you can see, since this is PHP, I'm using the array notation rather than the dot notation to separate the values. In order to do language overrides, you need to enable the language module and interface translation. The interface translation module is required by configuration translation. There's content translation and configuration translation. We will be talking about the second one because that's the subject of this talk. But then you add a language, whatever language you want. Again, these are Drupal core modules. And then you edit the translation for the configuration you want. Language overrides use the same configuration storage mechanism that any other configuration does. That is, it's stored in the database in the config table and are exported exactly the same way as other non-translated configuration. And the naming contains the language code for the particular language that you're exporting. So in this case, it would be language config, and then if it's French, FR system site, and that would contain all the configuration, the translated configuration for the system site configuration. And when you export, these go into a custom language folder inside of whatever your sync folder is defined to be. So we'll choose configuration translation, and I know that's gonna be needed, so do that. And I think when I do this, it will connect to Drupal.org and get, well, no, as soon as I create a language, it will go to connect to Drupal.org and get the translations that it knows about. Does anyone have a language preference?
Oh, Basque.
Basque?
Yes.
It's Spanish, I think.
All right. So again, it imports the translations that it knows about.
Is that for your content or for your config?
This is only configuration. So we can see that how many it imported. So now if I go to, my system site page, I have this tab to translate the system information. So we've got this PNW Drupal Summit, and we can say, all right, well, let's add,
Alright, Google Translate that. Oh, but you still have to put it in that language.
and then if I go and I say, in the sidebar, let's put a language switcher. Okay. And we get the translation.
Does that work for the admin? Oh, I did. I just see that. Ooh, is that?
Oh yeah,
is that
of course everything's been in the admin. It's been changed to Basque.
I see that in Drupal 7 too, and I was just wondering if it does that automatically. So it looks like it does. So that was automatic.
Yeah. One thing to point out is that the language overrides are really just a special instance of module overrides, and the reason that they don't take precedence over a module override that you write is because it's set to have a very light weight, minus 254, so it happens very early on in the override process. If you define your module override with minus 255, then you can actually sort of come in before the language override. But the language override is sort of meant to happen super early during the override process, so then you can work on the values from there. Any questions about language overrides? I don't remember. I actually don't know how a lot of this was handled in Drupal 7. I didn't do a lot of multilingual work in Drupal 7.
I do, but I mean, from
That's
I do a lot of it day to day.
So if you need to, in your code, in your PHP code, retrieve a configuration value without the overrides, you can. In this case, we're calling. We're using the config service, and we're getting the system site configuration, and we're saying get original, and we're saying we want the name. ID from the system site configuration. And passing in false says we don't want overrides. Another way to do it is to use the config factory service, and that will allow you to get an editable version of the configuration. You would use that if you wanted to retrieve the configuration, make some changes to it, and then save it back. Obviously, in that case, you're going to want the overridden version. And you can use drush. Again, that config get command that I did that gave the big long list. If you already know what your configuration is called, you can just refer to it directly in the command line. So in this case, we're getting the system site name. If you do want overrides, you can use the config service and just pass in true as the second argument, and that will give you the overridden value. Or you can use to get it without overrides, using the config factory service, you would use get editable. Oh, I guess you don't use config factory. You would just use. You could also do it just using the get method and whatever item you want. Again, the drush command. If you include the option include overridden, then you'll get the override values. You'll get the overridden value. So in order to override configuration in your own custom module, you need to create your own service and tag it with config factory override. And I'll show how that works. You will create a class, you'll implement config factory override interface, and then provide a method called load overrides where you actually perform the overrides. So I have a custom module that I created. I'm going to need to make this bigger, I know. So this module is called PNWDS, and here's my service file, where I'm providing the service that will do the override. So in this case, I'm saying I'm giving it a name, calling it config override. I'm defining the class that's going to handle it, and then here's that tag that I said you need to employ. And as soon as you do that, Drupal will pick it up. And Drupal will know this is an override. During the discovery process, it will find this and know that you want to do an override. And here's that priority level where I said that the language module uses -254, but you can make it happen very late in the process if you want, just by changing the weight here. So in this case, we are using a particular class called PNWDS config override, and that file is here. And as I mentioned, it needs to implement the config factory override interface, which requires a handful of methods, I think 4 methods, but the main one you're going to take advantage of is load overrides, and that's where you're going to pass back any overrides that need to be done. So you can see in this case, I'm doing something different depending on whether a user is logged in or not. So the site name will be for anonymous users, site for anonymous user, and for authenticated users, site for authenticated user. So it should take effect as soon as I enable the module. Oh, it's trying to update the configuration translation for the module. It's not going to find any. Okay, so yeah, it did already take effect. So you can see I'm logged in and I'm seeing a different site name than if I'm not logged in. There is a contributed module called config override, which provides a number of different ways that you can. It attempts to simplify doing overrides on your own. I don't have a ton of experience with this module. I've played around with it a bit, and it seems to work as expected. I think if you're able to understand how to get the config override module to do the overrides, you can probably write your own module or do it in some other manner. The config override module allows you to create a site-wide override folder where you put YAML files that match the same name as the exported configuration files that you get out of your module, so system.site. And define your overrides there, and it will pick them up. You can allow a module to define where the YAML files are, and I guess the main advantage to that is you could have the module enabled or disabled, and then you would be turning on and off overrides just using that module. And the third option is to use environmental variables on the server. And that was the only one I wasn't able to actually get working. The first two worked fine, but I must not have been doing it right. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that that was available as an option on Drupal.org. You can download it and give it a try. The key module is, like I say, one that I maintain, and we recently added the ability to override configuration using the key module. So what key does is allow you to manage site-wide keys, so API keys, passwords, encryption keys, and it gives you the ability to define where they're stored and how they're retrieved, which gives you additional options for security and can allow you to meet any regulatory requirements that you have. Like if you are not allowed to store encryption keys on the same server as the data, the key module will let you handle that. So storing keys in the database in configuration is dangerous for a number of reasons. One is that the key will be visible in settings forms for most modules. Some modules will hide the value once you've entered it once, so it won't actually display it again. But most will just show it to you. So if anybody ever gets access to that form, they see your PayPal API key or whatever it is. And it's stored in the database. So if anybody gets access either directly to your database or to a database backup, a dump of some kind, they're going to have access to your API key, your encryption key, passwords. And of course they're exported. If you're working with Drupal 8 in the way that you're supposed to, you're exporting your configuration, you're committing it to your Git repo. Now all of that is in your repository. So keeping that out is a good idea, and using configuration overrides will help you do that. But in this case, if you want to use key, what key does is provide alternative options for where to store your key values. So one option would be to have your key in a file outside of the web root, so that that's read whenever that key is needed. Or you can use an external key management service. Locker is one of them, and there's a module that goes along with it. It provides support for storing keys on Locker, and if you have questions about that, Chris Teitzel's your man. There's another one for a more heavy-duty solution for enterprise projects. The Townsend Security Alliance Key Manager has a key management service, and there's a module that goes along with that to provide that as an option within Key. So here's an example of the kind of keys, like I say, that you'd probably want to be extra careful with. An API key for if you're doing e-commerce to connect to your merchant, your financial merchant, your MailChimp API key, that sort of thing. SMTP, if you're using SMTP for sending out messages through Drupal, not having the password in the database but having it somewhere more secure is a good idea. If you're doing encryption, of course you're going to want the encryption key somewhere other than in the database. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick demo of key, how key works. Let's see. So I think I had MailChimp set up. No, I didn't. All right. I'm just going to use MailChimp as an example, just because a lot of people use that module and are familiar with it. So ordinarily, you have this API key field, and you would enter your API key there, and it's stored in the database. If you instead want to use key, let's see, well, let's delete this one that I apparently already had there. So when you're creating a key, you're allowed to you can choose what type of key it is, and the default is authentication, which is what we're going to use in this case. But encryption is also an option. Locker provides its own encryption service or encryption key type, which allows you to have an automatically generated random key created. And then these are two that we've added most recently, which allow you to store multiple values. Some module maintainers who are going to be integrating key wanted to be able to store multiple values in a single key. So this was just added a few weeks ago. In this case, we're going to choose authentication, and then here's where you can choose what provider you want to use. In this case, we're going to just stick with configuration just to make it easy, but this is not going to actually help us because it's just going to be storing it in the database anyway. But you'd probably want to choose something like File, or if you're using Locker or Townsend, you can choose those. And those all come with their own settings, so once you choose them, you can specify, in this case, where the file's located, and let's see, any other settings that are necessary for the key provider. So once we've created this, I can go here and say add a config override. So I can choose it there, or you may have noticed on the configuration synchronization page, we get a key overrides tab. So we'll see the various options available, and pretty much all configuration is available here. The only ones that aren't are key, because that would be weird to override. So in this case, we're going to choose simple configuration because that's what the MailChimp module provides. It's a site-wide setting. It's not a configuration entity. And MailChimp settings. And then we can choose which item we want to override. In this case, we're going to override the API key. And we're going to do that with the MailChimp API key that we created. And then there's this option to clear the overridden value, because if you did the override but you didn't change what was in the database, the value is still in the database. So this will clear that. If you don't want it cleared for some reason, you can uncheck it, but in this case we will.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Okay. If you create a configuration override with key and don't clear out the value from the database in the original value from the database, you haven't done much to improve your security because the old value is still there.
Okay. And then if you put that checkbox, it will write to the database on your behalf.
That's right. It'll write a null value to the database, which I can verify here if I say, what do we got?
So it writes a null value. It doesn't replace it with the new key. That just stays in the file.
Yes.
And it refers to that.
Exactly. You just want to clear out that value. So. There it is. Okay, so what we want is the config. Oh, I know. Okay, so no, we just want. Sorry, I forgot what I was doing. So you can see the API key, since I told it to clear that out, is now null. But if I had the include overridden option, now we have the value that is stored in the key. Does anybody have any questions about that, about how key works, why you would want to use it? Yes?
I'll just say it seems like an opportunity for like a honeypot situation to leave a wrong password in the database and then have a system that says if that's used,
yeah,
then block that IP.
That's really clever. I hadn't thought of that. So I think we're probably running short on time. We're out of time. I don't know what time I'm supposed to start, but let me just, or end. Let me just see if you have any questions. Any other questions? Yes?
So what do you mean by integrate with key?
Oh, yes, good question.
It's probably inserting itself using hooks or something in order to get into the middle of the configuration management on your behalf. What would a config module maintainer do to integrate further?
That's an excellent question. So it's not using hooks. Again, it's just using this this override service, which then allows it to provide the overrides. So the more the way to integrate better with key is to actually have it as a dependency, and instead of having on the form, instead of having a text field where you enter the value, you have a pop-up that shows you your keys, and you choose which key you want to use. And there are a handful of modules that are already integrated that way. The encrypt module is one of them. So if I come here to the encrypt profile page and I go to create an encryption profile, I can choose the encryption method. In this case, I'm going to choose real AES, and then I can choose my encryption key. I haven't created any encryption keys, so there's nothing available, but if I had, it would show up here. That's a more direct integration with a module. So the overrides is sort of a little bit of a stop as a transition measure until other modules provide more direct support in this way.
Well, can I just ask a follow-up? So
yeah.
It might be just, let's say you want to just demo a module, and the simple thing to do is, if the key module is not enabled on the system, just do it the old-fashioned way. If the key module is, then we're going to call that dialog and
yes.
something like that.
Yeah, that would be another way to do it, is to sort of be a little more flexible about it. Yes?
How would we go about expanding the where the keys can be stored? So for the key module, you had several places where keys can be. What about like AWS KMS or something like that, where we?
Yes,
Yeah.
I should have been repeating the questions. The question is about how you extend keys to add additional providers, and they just use a standard Drupal 8 plugin system. So they're defined as a plugin type. You just create a new plugin The ones that are included with key are all really good examples, and you could even just extend those if you have a need that is very similar. I know people who have written key providers, their own key provider to use internally for storing keys in a particular way that makes sense for their system.
Okay. There is a KMS sandbox out there.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much.